Ever wonder how a new drug goes from like a scientist's lab to your medicine cabinet?
It's a fascinating journey for sure.
Right. It's not magic.
Definitely not magic.
There's so much that goes on behind the scenes.
Absolutely, a lot of steps.
And today we're taking a deep dive into two really crucial parts of that process, advisory committees and public hearings.
They're kind of like checks and balances.
Yeah, exactly. They're all about ensuring that the medications we all end up using are safe and effective.
That's the goal, right?
Mm.
Making sure the drugs that make it to market actually do what they're supposed to and don't cause more harm than good.
So we're going to look at how these committees made up of experts and these opportunities for the public to weigh in, how they actually play a part in those decisions made by drug regulators like the FDA.
We're talking about transparency and how this all ultimately impacts what drugs get approved and even like how those drugs are labeled.
And to really illustrate how this works in the real world, we're going to use a recent case as an example, the story of Lycos and their drug, medomafetamine.
Yeah, that's a perfect example to unpack how this all plays out.
So let's start with these advisory committees.
Okay.
Who are these people and what's their primary job in this whole process?
Well, you can think of these committees as a group of independent experts brought in for their specific knowledge.
So we're talking doctors, scientists, statisticians.
Exactly. People who really understand the science behind the drug being reviewed, and this independence is crucial.
Why is that?
Well, it helps to safeguard against any potential bias, from the company that's actually developing the drug.
Makes sense. So it's a way to get a more objective evaluation of all the data.
Exactly. Their main role is to provide impartial advice and recommendations to the regulatory agencies like the FDA.
So they're basically advisors providing a second opinion.
Yeah, you could think of it that way, and they're tackling the complex scientific and medical questions that come up during the review.
So when does this expert team actually get called in during the drug review process?
It's not like they're involved in every single drug that comes along. It's typically when a regulatory agency is facing a situation where the data is particularly complex.
So if there's some debate about the results or maybe some concerns about the safety?
Exactly, or maybe if how well the drug works isn't entirely clear.
So it's like bringing in the big guns for the tough cases.
Yeah, and this usually happens after the company has submitted their whole application for approval, but before the agency makes their final decision.
So the drug company hands over this massive amount of research, their trial results, everything they've got.
It's a lot of information to sift through.
And what exactly does the advisory committee do with this mountain of data?
They really dig deep. They analyze everything the company has provided, but they don't stop there.
So they're not just taking the company's word for it.
No, they also look at any other relevant information that's out there.
So they could be published studies or even their own clinical insights from their own experience.
Exactly. And then the committee gets together, often in a public setting, to discuss the drug.
So it's very transparent.
Yes. And they'll hear presentations from the company, from the agency itself, and sometimes even from patients and advocates.
It's like a big meeting of the minds to figure out what's going on with this drug.
Yeah, and it leads to some really interesting discussions and debates.
So it's a weighing of the evidence, a back and forth about the pros and cons.
Precisely. They're focused on the key questions. Is this drug safe enough for the people it's intended for?
And does it actually work? Does the evidence show that it's effective?
Exactly. And this whole process usually ends with a vote.
So each member of the committee gets to say, I think this drug should be approved, or I don't think it should be approved.
Yeah, it's like a collective expert opinion that they give to the regulatory agency.
So that's got to be it, right? If the experts say no, the drug's basically dead in the water.
Not always, but it's definitely a major hurdle to overcome.
It's like getting a thumbs down from the people who know the most about this stuff.
Yeah, and while the agency isn't legally bound to follow the committee's recommendation, they do take it very seriously.
It's like getting advice from your most trusted advisor. You're probably going to listen to what they have to say.
And a negative vote from an advisory committee carries a lot of weight.
Okay, so that's the expert perspective. But we also mentioned public hearings.
Right.
How do those fit into this whole picture?
Public hearings offer a different but equally important kind of input.
So we're shifting gears a bit.
Yeah, this is where patients who might actually benefit from the drug, their families, advocacy organizations, all these different voices get to share their perspectives.
So it's less about the hardcore scientific data and more about the real-world experience of living with the condition the drug is supposed to treat.
Exactly. Patients can talk about what it's like to live with the illness, what their current treatment options are like, if those options are working for them or not.
And what they hope this new drug might do for them.
Right. It's about highlighting the unmet needs and sharing their thoughts on the potential benefits and risks of the new drug.
It brings the human element into the decision-making process.
It's a crucial reminder that these decisions affect real people's lives.
And that gives the regulators a much richer understanding of the situation.
It helps them to understand the potential real-world impact of their decision from the patient's perspective.
Because at the end of the day, it's the patients who will be taking these drugs.
And that's why these hearings are so important for transparency in the whole regulatory process.
So let's talk more about that transparency.
Okay.
How do these expert committees and public hearings make the drug approval process more open and accountable?
Well, for one thing, as we mentioned, advisory committee meetings are often open to the public. Anyone can attend.
So it's not some secret meeting behind closed doors.
No. And recordings of the meetings are often made available afterwards, too.
So you can go back and listen to what was discussed.
Exactly. And all the documents that the committee looks at, like the agenda, the data, the meeting minutes, those are often publicly accessible as well.
It's like putting everything out in the open so everyone can see what's going on.
Right. And public hearings, by their very nature, are open forums for discussion.
So anyone can come and share their thoughts.
Exactly. And this openness is really important because it allows researchers, journalists, patient groups, anyone who's interested to really understand how these decisions are being made.
It's about building trust in the system.
And holding everyone accountable.
So we've talked about the experts and we've talked about the public input,
Yeah.
but how do those actually influence the final decision on whether a drug gets approved or not and what its label will look like?
It's a complex process, but ultimately the decision rests with the regulatory agency.
But the experts and the public do have a say.
Yes, their input is a critical part of the overall evaluation.
So a strong positive recommendation from the advisory committee makes it much more likely that the drug will get approved.
Right. And on the flip side, a negative recommendation, as we discussed, can be a big obstacle.
It's not a guarantee, but it definitely makes things more difficult.
And what about those public hearings? Can a really compelling patient story actually sway the regulators?
That's a good question.
While individual stories might not override strong scientific evidence, the themes and concerns that come up during a public hearing can definitely influence the agency's thinking.
Especially when it comes to understanding the balance between the risks and benefits of a drug from the patient's perspective.
Exactly. And it can also have a direct impact on the drug's labeling.
The information that comes with the drug about how to use it safely and effectively.
Right. The labeling might include details about potential side effects to watch out for or specific groups of patients who should or shouldn't use the drug.
So these discussions can lead to a more comprehensive and patient-focused approach to labeling.
It's about making sure that the information about the drug is clear and relevant to the people who will be using it.
Okay, so we've laid out the general process, but let's get back to our case study, Lycos and their drug, medomafetamine.
Right. Let's see how this all played out in a real-world scenario.
So what was the situation with this drug?
Well, medomafetamine was under review for a specific medical condition, and as part of that process, it went before an advisory committee, just like we've been talking about.
And what happened at that meeting?
The advisory committee ultimately issued a negative recommendation.
So the majority of the experts voted against approving the drug.
Yes, that's correct.
Wow. That's a big setback, as we've discussed. So what were the main reasons why they decided to recommend against approval?
Well, based on the information that's publicly available and the typical factors that are considered in these kinds of decisions, the concerns usually revolve around two key things: efficacy and safety.
Efficacy meaning, does the drug actually work? And safety meaning, is it safe enough to use?
Exactly. So the committee would have carefully weighed all the data that Lycos presented, looking at whether the evidence was strong enough to show that the drug works for its intended purpose and whether any potential risks or side effects outweighed those benefits.
So it's a balancing act, trying to figure out if the potential benefits outweigh the potential risks.
Absolutely. And some of the specific concerns might have been things like how strong and consistent the clinical trial results were, how big of an effect the drug had, and whether any red flags came up about potential safety issues during those studies.
So they're really scrutinizing everything to make sure that the drug is both effective and safe.
That's the goal.
Was there a public hearing held for medomafetamine as well?
It's actually quite common for drugs that are meant to treat serious conditions, especially ones where there aren't many good treatment options already available.
So if there's a big unmet need for a drug like this, they want to hear from the patients who might benefit from it.
Exactly, and that would have given patients and advocacy groups a chance to share their perspectives specifically on medomafetamine.
So we have the expert committee recommending against approval, and potentially the public weighing in as well. What did the regulatory agency ultimately decide?
In the case of medomafetamine, the agency decided to follow the advisory committee's recommendation.
So they didn't approve the drug for its intended use at that time.
That's correct.
It really shows how much weight these advisory committees can have in the final decision.
Yes, they play a crucial role in the process.
It's a complicated system, but it seems like there are a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that drugs are thoroughly vetted before they become available to patients,
It's about finding the right balance between being cautious and being innovative.
making sure that new treatments are both safe and effective.
And that's not always an easy task.
So to sum up our deep dive today, advisory committees made up of independent experts and public hearings where patients and advocates can have their voices heard are both incredibly important parts of the drug approval process.
They add layers of scrutiny and transparency to the decisions that are being made.
And they can have a major impact on the final outcome, as we saw with Lycos and medomafetamine.
They're not just rubber stamps, they're actively involved in shaping the future of medicine.
It makes you think about the whole process in a different light, doesn't it?
It definitely highlights the complexity of bringing new drugs to market.
There's the rigorous scientific evaluation, but then there's also the human side of it, the experiences of the patients who are waiting for new treatments.
It's about finding a balance between those different perspectives.
And the regulatory agencies have the tough job of trying to weigh all of that information and make the best decision for the public's health.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It really is, and it raises some interesting questions for all of us to think about.
Like how much weight should be given to the opinions of experts versus the needs of patients?
And how can we ensure that the drug approval process is as transparent and accountable as possible?
These are questions that we all need to be thinking about as new drugs and new technologies continue to emerge.
Absolutely. So we encourage you to keep learning about this if you're interested.
Yeah.
Go check out the information about specific advisory committee meetings. It's all publicly available. The agendas, the discussions, even the voting records, you can see how the decisions are made.
And take a look at the regulations that govern drug approval. It's all out there if you want to learn more.
It's a fascinating glimpse into the behind-the-scenes world of drug development.
It really is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive,
It was great to be here.
and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.